Okay, here's a fact most people don't know. Your ancestor could tell three different people three completely different answers about where he was born, and every single one of those people could be writing down exactly what they heard. That's not a hypothetical. That's what happened with the man at the center of today's episode. His church marriage register says he was born in New York. The 1880 census, 5 years later, says he was born in Germany. His death certificate, 4 decades after that, says he was born in Pennsylvania. Three records, three different birthplaces, three different countries and states. And here's the part that kept me up at night. One of those wrong answers came straight from the man himself, spoken directly to his own pastor, written into the church register in the pastor's own hand. So, which record do you trust? And how do you build a professional conclusion when the evidence is fighting you at every turn? That's GPS element 4, and today we are cracking it wide open. Let's dive in. Welcome to Ancestors and Algorithms, where family history meets artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Brian, and today we are digging into one of the most common and most maddening situations in genealogy: the ancestor whose records flatly contradict each other on the most basic fact you can imagine. Where was this person born? Not off by a year, not a name spelling variant. Three completely different answers: a church register, a census, and a death certificate, and not one of them agrees. Today is the second episode in our GPS miniseries. If you caught episode 30, you know we walked through all 5 elements of the genealogical proof standard together. Today, we go deep on element 4, the resolution of conflicting evidence. And the AI workflow I walk you through today changes how you approach contradictory records. Not just for this case, for every case you will ever research. So let's get started. Let me introduce you to the man at the center of today's episode. His name is Conrad Becker. He's a composite ancestor I built specifically for this episode because the pattern of contradictions he represents is so common that I'm confident most of you are going to recognize it from your own research. Conrad was born in 1845 in the Rhine Province of Prussia, near a city called Koblenz, in what is today Western Germany. He immigrated to the United States sometime around 1866 or 1867, arriving through the port of New York. And this is where his American story begins, in the packed tenement streets of Lower Manhattan in a neighborhood called Klein Deutschland. That translates to Little Germany, and for good reason. By the 1850s and 1860s, Klein Deutschland was the largest German-speaking community outside of Berlin and Vienna. Tens of thousands of German immigrants lived, worked, worshipped, and read German-language newspapers within those 400 city blocks. For a young man arriving alone from the Rhine province, stepping off a ship into New York, this neighborhood was not just a place to live. It was home. It was the first place in America that felt familiar. Conrad spent roughly 5 to 6 years in New York. He worked, he saved, and sometime around 1872 or 1873, he followed the same path that many Klein Deutschland residents took when they were ready to build a more permanent life. He headed to the Pennsylvania coal fields. Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania was drawing immigrant workers from across Europe. Irish, Welsh, Eastern European, and German miners all came to work the anthracite seams. Conrad settled there, found work in the mines, and joined a German-speaking Lutheran congregation that served the German immigrant community in the area. In 1875, he married a woman named Anna Hoffman at that congregation. They stayed in Schuylkill County for the rest of their lives. Conrad died there in 1921. So far, a fairly typical story for a German immigrant of that era. Now, here's where it falls apart. When I pull the three most important records we have for Conrad, this is what I find. Record 1, Conrad's marriage entry in the German Lutheran Church Register, Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, 1875. Groom, Conrad Becker, age 30, birthplace listed, New York. Record 2, the 1880 US Federal Census for Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. Name, Conrad Becker, age 35, birthplace, Germany. Record 3, Conrad's death certificate, Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, 1921. Name, Conrad Becker, age at death, 76, birthplace listed, Pennsylvania. Informant, William Becker, son of deceased. New York, Germany, Pennsylvania. Now, I want to stop right here because I need to tell you something about Record 1 that makes this case different from a typical clerical error. The church marriage register was not filled out by a government clerk who misheard something. It was filled out by Conrad's own pastor, in German, in a register kept by Conrad's own congregation. The pastor almost certainly asked Conrad directly, "Where were you born?" And Conrad answered. And what Conrad said, or what the pastor understood him to say, was New York. That changes things. Because now we are not just dealing with someone else writing down the wrong information. We are potentially dealing with an ancestor who gave his own pastor a birthplace answer that does not match any physical location where he was actually born. Why would he do that? And before you answer too quickly, consider this. You've been told by every genealogy teacher you have ever had that death certificate birthplace information is unreliable because the informant was not present at the deceased birth. Fair enough, but the church register is a different problem entirely. The informant was Conrad. He was present at his own birth. This is why GPS Element 4 exists. The resolution of conflicting evidence is not about deciding which record wins and filing the others away. It's about understanding why each record says what it says in a way that accounts for all of them and holds up to scrutiny. Because if I can't explain the church register entry, my conclusion is not defensible. A record does not become irrelevant just because it disagrees with me. This is also the heart of our golden rule. AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. I'm not going to ask an AI to tell me where Conrad Becker was born. That's my conclusion to build and my conclusion to defend. What I'm going to do is use 3 AI tools to help me understand the landscape of why each record says what it says. And then I will reach my own finding. Let me walk you through this step by step because the approach works for any conflicting records you encounter in your own research. You can pause, grab a notebook, and adapt every prompt I share today to your own ancestor. Before we get into the tools, there's one foundational idea I want you to carry with you throughout this episode. Every record you find has 3 layers: the source itself, the information inside it, and the evidence that information provides for your specific question. A church marriage register is a reliable source for the names of the parties who married because the pastor was there. But is it a reliable source for where the groom was born? That depends entirely on how the pastor asked the question and what the groom understood by it. Those are 2 different reliability evaluations from the same document. That principle is GPS Element 2, and is going to do a lot of the work for us today. My first move was Perplexity using the Comet Browser mode. As of April 2026, Comet Browser gives Perplexity real-time access to current web sources with citations rather than relying solely on its training data. Check perplexity.ai for the latest on what it can do because these tools update frequently. I needed historical context before I touched any of the records analytically. Specifically, I needed to understand 2 things: what German Immigrant Lutheran Church registers typically captured, and whether there are documented patterns of German immigrants giving non-German locations as their birthplace in American records of this era. Here's the exact prompt I used. Quote, search for scholarly and genealogical sources on two related topics. First, what information did German immigrant Lutheran church registers in 19th century Pennsylvania typically record for marriage entries, particularly regarding birthplace of the bride and groom? Second, are there documented patterns in how German immigrants in the mid to late 19th century reported their birthplace in American records? And specifically, any research on why some immigrants reported an American city as their birthplace where they were in fact born in Germany? Please cite your sources, end quote. Notice what I did with that prompt? I didn't ask Perplexity to explain my specific ancestor. I asked it to help me understand the broader historical context for the record type and the population of people this ancestor belonged to. That context is what lets me evaluate the records intelligently. This is GPS Element 1, reasonably exhaustive research. Before I draw any conclusions, I want to understand the landscape. What Perplexity returned shaped everything that followed. Let me walk you through the key findings. On German Lutheran church registers in Pennsylvania, Perplexity confirmed that German immigrant congregations in 19th century Pennsylvania maintained detailed Kirchenbücher, meaning church books or registers, following the meticulous German church record-keeping traditions they brought with them from home. These registers routinely recorded the birthplace of both parties in a marriage entry, more reliably than many contemporary civil records. The pastor typically asked each party directly, often in German, since these were German-speaking congregations. The information was considered important for the congregation's own records of its members' origins. And here's where it gets interesting. Perplexity surfaced something from genealogical research literature that I had not fully considered before. There is a documented pattern among German immigrants, particularly those who had spent significant time in an American city before settling elsewhere, of giving their American city of residence as their birthplace when asked. This is not always deception or confusion. For some immigrants, especially for those who had lived for 5 or more years in a place like Klein-Deutschland, New York, had become their identity in a way that Germany had not. Think about what that means for Conrad. He left Koblenz as a young man of 21 or 22. He spent his formative adult years in New York. He built his first American life there. When his pastor, conducting the marriage ceremony in Germany, asked him where he was born, could have been answered with Conrad's psychological home in America rather than the German village he left a decade earlier. Whether Conrad genuinely misunderstood the question or whether New York was simply how he thought of himself is something we can't know from the record alone. But it is historically plausible in a way I had not fully appreciated before running this search. On death certificates, Perplexity confirmed what experienced genealogists know. Birthplace information on death certificates is among the least reliable data on the document because the informant is almost always reporting on events they did not witness. An adult child who provides their parents' birthplace on a death certificate is giving secondary information by definition. They weren't there. And in Conrad's case, his son William had spent his entire life in Pennsylvania. William knew his father as a Pennsylvania man. That is the environment that shaped what William understood about his father's origins. So, before I have analyzed a single record with AI, I have a historical framework. The church register entry might reflect Conrad's psychological identification with New York after years of living there. The census entry is likely more reliable because the birthplace question was more standardized by 1880, and Conrad or Anna provided it directly to the enumerator. The death certificate is the least reliable for birthplace because William had no firsthand knowledge of where his father was born. That framework is not an answer. It's a set of hypotheses to test. Now it was time to bring in Claude. Claude is where I do the systematic analytical work because multi-document comparison and evidence hierarchy evaluation are exactly what Claude does best. I typed out the key details from each of my 3 records carefully and built this prompt. Quote, I have 3 records for what I believe is the same person. Please do the following in this exact order. First, create a systematic comparison table showing where these records agree and where they conflict. Second, evaluate each record's reliability as a source for birthplace information specifically. For each record, tell me who provided the birthplace information, what their relationship to the event was, when the information was recorded relative to the person's actual birth, and what factors might affect its accuracy. Third, identify which conflict is most significant to resolve and explain why. Do not give me your conclusion about where this person was born. I want your analysis only so I can reach my own finding. Here are the records. Record 1, German Lutheran Church Marriage Register, Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, 1875. Groom Conrad Becker, age 30, birthplace listed, New York. Bride Anna Hoffman, record kept in German by the officiating pastor. Record 2, 1880 US Federal Census, Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. Name Conrad Becker, age 35, birthplace Germany, father's birthplace Germany, mother's birthplace Germany, occupation coal miner. Record 3, Pennsylvania Death Certificate 1921. Name Conrad Becker, age at death 76, birthplace listed Pennsylvania, informant William Becker, son of deceased, end quote. Let me explain the structure of that prompt because the structure matters as much as the content. I told Claude exactly what to do and in what order. I asked for reliability evaluation on birthplaces specifically, not on the records in general. And critically, I told Claude not to give me the conclusion. The moment I let Claude reach the finding, I have stopped doing genealogy and started doing something else. The conclusion has to be mine. Claude's job is to help me see the evidence clearly. What Claude returned was genuinely illuminating. Let me walk you through the most important pieces. On the comparison table, Claude immediately flagged the obvious. New York, Germany, and Pennsylvania can't all be the birthplace of the same person. It mapped where the records agree. All three agree on the name Conrad Becker. All three are consistent with a birth year of approximately 1845. And all three place him in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania during his adult life. The disagreement is entirely on the birthplace field. On reliability evaluation by record, this is where Claude's analysis sharpened my thinking considerably. For record 1, the church register, Claude noted something I had been thinking about but had not fully articulated. The church register is an original record created at the time of the event, which generally adds to its reliability. But the specific piece of information we care about, Conrad's birthplace, was provided by Conrad himself. He was the informant for his own birthplace. That sounds like it should make this the most reliable record of all. And in most cases it would be. But Claude flagged a complicating factor, the question of what the informant understood the question to be asking. A man who spent 5 or 6 years in Kleindeutschland before moving to Pennsylvania, asked by a German-speaking pastor where he was from, may have answered the question he understood rather than the question the record was designed to capture. For record 2, the 1880 census, Claude noted that this was also recorded while Conrad was alive and accessible. The census enumerator asked household members directly, and the 1880 census birthplace field was a well-established, standardized question by that point. The supporting evidence is significant. The census also records Conrad's father's birthplace as Germany and his mother's birthplace as Germany. A man born in New York would not typically have two German-born parents listed without any further notation. This corroborating internal evidence makes the census entry stronger than it might appear on its own. For record 3, the death certificate, Claude's analysis confirmed the secondary informant problem directly. William Becker, listed as the son of the deceased, was not present at his father's birth. He was reporting on an event that happened before he existed. The likelihood that William knew with certainty where his father was born in Germany, or distinguished between Germany and Pennsylvania as a birthplace, is low. This is the weakest of the 3 records for birthplace information. But here's where I made a mistake. And I want to tell you about it because I think it is a mistake a lot of us make at exactly this stage of the process. After reading Claude's analysis, I thought I had it figured out. The 1880 census says Germany. That's the most reliable. The death certificate says Pennsylvania, which is a secondary informant error. And the church register says New York because Conrad had a loose understanding of birthplace as meaning where he had been living in America. Case closed. Except I hadn't resolved the conflict. I'd explained it away. There's a meaningful difference between those two things. Explaining a conflict away means deciding you understand why the inconvenient record exists and moving past it. Resolving a conflict means building a documented explanation that accounts for each record's testimony in a way you can defend to another researcher. If someone looked at my work and asked, "Why does this church register say New York?" Conrad probably meant his American residence is not a defensible answer. Quote, "Here's what we know about how German immigrants of this era reported their American location as birthplace, and here's why that explanation is consistent with the specific circumstances of Conrad's life," end quote, is. That discomfort, that feeling that my explanation was not quite right enough, sent me to ChatGPT. ChatGPT's strength is lateral thinking and brainstorming. When I need to generate a wide field of possible explanations before I start narrowing down, ChatGPT is my tool of choice. Different tools for different tasks. That is the tool to function lock in practice. Here's exactly what I asked. Quote, "I am a genealogist working to resolve a conflict in 3 records for the same German immigrant ancestor. The conflict is specifically about birthplace. His German Lutheran Church marriage register from 1875 lists his birthplace as New York. His 1880 census record lists his birthplace as Germany. His 1921 death certificate lists his birthplace as Pennsylvania. Here's what I know about him. He was born around 1845 in the Rhine Province of Prussia, immigrated to the United States in the mid to late 1860s, lived in the German immigrant neighborhood of Kleindeutschland in Lower Manhattan for approximately 5 to 6 years, then moved to Pennsylvania's Schuylkill County coal region where he lived for the rest of his life. The church register was recorded in German by his Lutheran pastor, who would likely have asked him for the birthplace question directly in German. Please brainstorm every plausible historical and psychological explanation for why this man might have told his own pastor that his birthplace was New York. Then rank these explanations by how well they fit the specific circumstances I have described. I want explanations I might not have considered on my own," end quote. I want to highlight one thing about how that prompt is constructed. I gave ChatGPT the full historical context, the Kleindeutschland background, the German-speaking pastor, the timing. I didn't just say, "Why would someone say the wrong birthplace?" I gave ChatGPT the actual situation and asked it to brainstorm explanations that fit. Vague prompts produce vague brainstorms. Specific prompts produce specific, useful ones. What ChatGPT returned was the most valuable output of this entire research process. Let me share the top explanations and how I evaluated each one. The highest ranked explanation was also the most human one. ChatGPT suggested that after 5 or 6 years of living in Kleindeutschland, Conrad had genuinely internalized New York as his place of origin in America. When a German-speaking pastor asked, "Wo sind Sie geboren?" Conrad may have heard, "Where do you come from?" rather than, "Where were you physically born?" For an immigrant who had built this entire American identity in New York, those two questions have very different answers. Germany is where he was born. New York is where he came from. The second explanation was linguistic. In 19th century German immigrant communities, the phrase geboren could sometimes be interpreted more flexibly than its strict English translation of born. There are documented cases in genealogical research literature of immigrants using birthplace fields to record their last place of residence before arriving in their current community, particularly when the person giving the information had spent significant time in that prior location. The third explanation, And the one I found most interesting from a teaching perspective was social identity. ChatGPT noted that immigrants in close knit communities like Klein Deutschland often developed a strong identification with their American neighborhood in a way that could override their senses of German origin in certain social contexts. Telling a pastor in a German Lutheran church conducted in German that you were born in New York might also have been a way of signaling, I am an American now. I have built my life here. This is who I am. Now, I want to be clear about what ChatGPT just gave me. This is a menu of hypotheses, not answers. AI is your research assistant, not your researcher. My job is to take these explanations, weigh them against everything I know about Conrad's specific life and the historical context I gathered from Perplexity, and determine which explanation is most defensible given all the evidence. And that is GPS element 4. That is the entire point of today. GPS element 3 is also happening right now, by the way. The analysis and correlation of evidence. I am taking Claude's document comparison, Perplexity's historical research on German church registers and immigrant identity, and ChatGPT's brainstormed explanations, and I am weaving them together into a coherent picture. No single tool gave me the full story. The story is emerging from the combination. Let me tell you what the evidence actually says when I step back and look at the whole picture. The 1880 census is the most reliable of the three records for Conrad's actual birthplace. When the census enumerator knocked on Conrad's door in Schuylkill County in June of 1880, Conrad was 35 years old and had been living in America for over a decade. He or his wife Anna answered the birthplace question the same way they would have answered any practical question about his origins: Germany. The answer is also internally corroborated in a way that matters. The 1880 census records Conrad's father's birthplace as Germany and his mother's birthplace as Germany. That is 3 data points from a single record that all hang together consistently around a German origin. No one born in New York in 1845 has 2 German-born parents without any note of American birth. The census entry of Germany is well supported. The death certificate is the least reliable of the 3 for birthplace, and for a reason that is completely understandable once you know who provided the information. Conrad's son William was born in Pennsylvania around 1877. He spent his entire life in Schuylkill County. He knew his father as a Pennsylvania coal miner who had worked the same mines for decades. When the death certificate register asked William where his father was born, William, grieving and quite possibly never having had a detailed conversation with an aging parent about life before America, wrote what he knew: Pennsylvania. This is not dishonesty. It's a son doing the best he can with incomplete information. It's also one of the most thoroughly documented patterns in death certificate reliability research, particularly for immigrant families. The church register is the most interesting of the 3, and also the one that requires the most careful thinking. Because Conrad told his own pastor his birthplace was New York. He was not misheard by a government official. He was not reported on by a child who didn't know him well. He spoke to his pastor in German in his own language about his own life. And he said New York. Here's the conclusion I reached, and here's how I arrived at it. Conrad Becker spent 5 to 6 years of his most formative adult years in Klein Deutschland. He arrived as a young man who had just crossed an ocean. He built his first American friendships there. He found his first American work there. When his pastor asked him where he was from, the question, Wo sind Sie geboren? Almost certainly registered in Conrad's mind not as a request for a German village name he had left a decade earlier, but as a question about who he was and where he had come from in America. New York was Conrad's answer because New York was Conrad's American origin, even if it was not the town in Prussia where he entered the world. By 1880, 5 years after the marriage register was completed, Conrad had been in Pennsylvania long enough that the question had a different answer. The census enumerator's standardized birthplace question, combined with a decade more of distance from New York, produced the accurate answer: Germany. That is where he was born, and that is the answer that is corroborated by his parents' birthplaces in the same record. So here's my conclusion, stated the way GPS Element 5 requires: soundly reasoned based on the totality of the evidence and honest about what it cannot prove. Conrad Becker was born in Germany, in the Rhine Province of Prussia around 1845. He immigrated to the United States in the mid to late 1860s, arriving through the port of New York, and spent approximately 5 to 6 years living and working in the German immigrant community of Klein-Deutschland in Lower Manhattan. He relocated to Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania around 1872 to 1873, married Anna Hoffman at his German Lutheran congregation in 1875, and lived and worked in the coal region until his death in 1921. The 1880 census birthplace entry of Germany is the most reliable evidence of his national origin, corroborated by the parallel entries for his father's and mother's birthplaces. The death certificate entry of Pennsylvania reflects secondary informant error by a son who had limited knowledge of his father's origins before Pennsylvania. The church register entry of New York reflects Conrad's own psychological identification with New York as his American origin, spoken to his pastor in the moment of his marriage in the language of his homeland. I can't prove the church register explanation with a single document. What I can do is show that it is consistent with the historical patterns of how German immigrants of this era reported their American locations, consistent with the specific circumstances of Conrad's 5 to 6 year residency in Klein-Deutschland, and consistent with the corroborating evidence from the 1880 census. That is the standard GPS Element 4 requires. Not certainty, but a defensible explanation that accounts for the conflicting record rather than ignoring it. And here's the thing I want you to carry out of today's episode. The church register error is the most interesting record in this whole case. Not the most reliable, but the most interesting. Because it tells us something about Conrad as a person that the census and death certificate don't. It tells us that New York mattered to him, that his American life began there in a way that was real and meaningful enough to be the answer he gave when his pastor asked who he was. Genealogy doesn't just find facts. When we do it right, it finds people. Your homework this week is this. Find one conflicting record in your own research, just one, and run the 3-step approach from today. Step 1, use Perplexity to research the historical context for that record type. Who provided the information? What did that record type typically capture? What are the known patterns of error or ambiguity for that field? Step 2, use Claude to compare your conflicting records systematically. Ask Claude to evaluate each record's reliability for your specific question, identify who the informant was, and flag which conflicts are most significant. Tell Claude not to give you the conclusion. Step 3, use ChatGPT to brainstorm every plausible explanation for the most puzzling contradiction. Give it the full historical context of your ancestor's life. Ranked explanations are more useful than unranked ones, so ask for the ranking. Then the 4th step is yours alone. Evaluate the hypotheses against the evidence, write your conclusion, and document why you reached it. That last step cannot be delegated to any tool. That is the work only you can do. Our next GPS mini-series episode, episode 38, takes on Element 1 in depth. What does reasonably exhaustive research actually mean in the age of AI? And how do you use these tools to make sure you've not missed something important? That one is coming up, and I'm looking forward to it. And for my Australian and UK listeners, the 3-step conflict resolution framework we walked through today works directly with your records. Conflicting birthplace entries are extremely common in convict transportation records, colonial census data, and Australian death certificates from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Trove at trove.nla.gov.au and the National Archives of Australia at naa.gov.au both have excellent source guides explaining how those records were created and where the common failure points occur. For UK researchers, the same conflict patterns appear throughout English, Scottish, and Welsh census records and General Register Office civil registration. Scotland's People at scotlandspeople.gov.uk and Find My Past at findmypast.co.uk have source reliability guides worth reading before you draw conclusions from any individual record. Same approach, different archives. Thank you so much for listening to Ancestors and Algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you know a fellow genealogist or family history researcher who could benefit from what we covered today, share this episode with them. That is the best way to help our community grow. For my Patreon members, the companion guide for this episode is now in your library. You will find 12 advanced prompts built around the most common types of genealogical conflicts, birthplace contradictions, age discrepancies, name variations, conflicting death information, and immigrant identity questions. I also walk through a multi-tool workflow using all 3 tools from today in a structured sequence, plus a GPS research checklist tailored specifically to resolving conflicting evidence. And if you've been thinking about joining, I host a monthly live Q&A sessions on YouTube exclusively for members where we work through real research problems together. Head to ancestorsandai.com to learn more about what memberships include. I'm your host, Brian, and I will see you next week for another journey into the past, powered by the future. Until then, happy researching.